Yes, this session will focus on the environmental state policy through two perspectives, the colonial one and the imperial one. And it will show also how the states claim to implement the best way to manage natural resources. And this way to manage from the states, it's often, especially during the colonial time, present at the expense of the local form of natural resource management. So we will begin to address the issue about the tension between the state's mode of resource management and the local modes of resource management. And we will have another session will be dedicated to this specific issue and to show the diversity of the local conception, the local uses, and the local management of environment. After these two presentations, Mr. Vaudekliem, which is a faculty member at the Department of History at National University of Education and doing his PhD at Hamburg University, and he will discuss the two presentations and open the floor for the general discussion. Just few points about the technical issue. So it's already done. Everyone already cut off the microphone. So it's better during the time when the people speak, we cut the microphone. I also have the power to cut the microphone. So if you don't do it, I can do it. After, for the general discussion, there is a way to raise the hand. I mean, when you want to take the floor to speak, you can do it. So don't hesitate to use that, and we will try to manage to be sure that everybody can comment or ask questions. Anyway, yes, there is no camera for everyone. So those who can put off the camera, please do it. It will be warmer if we can see everyone. And after, when we will do the discussion, so raise the hand and we will try to give you the floor. Okay. So we know that also the current event in America, the political issue, it's quite sensitive now. So of course, it's not the place to speak about that. But we just want to say to our American colleague that we can share solidarity about this issue. And as you know, everywhere in the world and also in France, we have similar issue related to racism and police violence. Okay. Frédéric, you want to say something? You want to take the floor, please?
Yeah. Thank you, Emmanuel, for this very comprehensive introduction. Yes, I could not begin this session with our American guest without saying in very simple word our solidarity with American people and particularly with Black Americans. I want to say to Bradley and to all other American colleagues who are participating in this webinar, that we are close to you and we know that the true identity of United States is democracy, humanism, and respect of cultural diversity, not racism and white supremacists. And we are very, very close to you in that moment. So with no more transition, let me start to my talk today. So I will share my PowerPoint. So it will take to me a little Microsoft PowerPoint. It must be this. Do you have it? Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet. Okay.
Now it's good. Now it seems okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. So, let's start. Usually, I don't really like to display my plan in the beginning of a talk to keep a bit of suspense. But as we are not face to face, perhaps it's better for you to know that directly that I will focus on historiographical review of nature conservation on empire. And it will give me the opportunity to give you basic definition, not to confuse preservation, conservation, green imperialism, ecological imperialism. In a second part, I will try to give you an idea of colonial imaginary of tropical forest in Indochina. The third part will examine the colonial forest conservation policy for itself, and particularly the classification of an important number of forest reserves. And in my last part, I will address the question whether the French forestry was conservation or preservation of nature or something else. And you can guess it's something else according to me. So part one. Part one. To begin this part, I will come back for a while in the United States to recall that the history of environmental thought considered that the core of modern environmental thought was born in USA, particularly with the American attachment to the American wilderness, that is to say, pristine nature with no anthropic print, which was very white Protestant state of mind, forgotten the Indian native, of course, but this state of mind want to see in the wilderness the holy creation of God. John Muir, as you see on this picture, is a good example of this state of mind. He's one of the most famous American nature preservation advocates in the 19th century, who devoted his life to travel through this American wilderness. Henry Thoreau, George Perkins March, Aldo Leopold also deserve to be quoted among many other figures of modern environmental thought in the United States. And you see here some of their major books. If we compare this American tradition to what happened at the same time in Europe, it is totally different. In Europe, we don't have this idea of wilderness first. We don't have the same tradition, and we don't have this kind of figures. And perhaps this explains that up to the 1990s, as I was saying, the history of environmental thought considers that the core of modern environmental thought was born in the USA with their great national park that the equivalent didn't exist in Europe at that time. This historiography, concentrated of what I call North American roots on North American father, has brought out two great tendencies among environmentalists. I recall this, it's very well known, I suppose, but I recall this very quickly. The preservationists, who, like John Muir, wanted to preserve nature for its own sake, and the conservationist partisan of a pragmatic approach aiming to reconcile conservation and exploitation of natural resources like Aldo Leopold and also the Forester Pinchot. Of course, this is a rather crude division because when you want to place the works of each author in one of these two categories, you skew their true position, but this distinction between preservationism and conservationism is very useful to understand the different trends in the history of nature protection policy. So since the 1990s, this historiography has been denounced as too narrow, forgetting other roots of environmental thought, especially European ones, with links with great discovery, exploration, and colonization. The colonial encounter, the contact with nature in the tropic and with extra-European culture would thus be another breeding ground of modern environmental thought. Except the American father, in front of some new figures, many are older than the American father. They come from 18th century, like Alexander von Humboldt, with deep link with German nature philosophy, and also people like Pierre Poivre, Philibert Commerson in the Isles of Mauritius, Paragon in India, John Crombie Browns in Cap Colony, and later for France, Auguste Chevalier in West Africa and Indochina. Or another guy you see also on this slide, Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, the famous French romantic writer of Paul et Virginie, and also a great botanist and a great traveler all around the world. So colonial roots of environmental thoughts seems to really exist, with also great major from figure from 18th and 19th century, with close relation with romantic movement in Germany, France, Great Britain, and all over Europe until the Russia with Pierre the Great. In fact, this rooting of environmental thought in colonial encounters owes a lot to Richard Groove's books, Green Imperialism, in 1995. Richard Groove identified the important role the utopians, the physiocrat and doctor in the colony had in the emergence of contemporary environmental thoughts. He showed that this personality had genuine environmental concerns in the face of the environmental crisis provoked by colonization. And he also showed the influence of these early environmentalists on the colonial administration in islands like Saint Vincent or Mauritius. From this example, Richard Groove insisted on the causation link between colonization and the rise of global environmental concerns and theory of global environmental changes. In so doing, Groove overturned the image of the colonization effect on the environment of the colonized countries. The dominant thesis up to him was that colonization had essentially been destructive, with no consideration for conservation of resources and even less for the preservation of environment. The notion of colonial plunder, le pillage colonial en français, prevailed in the past colonial historiography, and in many respects, this thesis was strengthened by the first work, which focused seriously on the environmental impact of colonization. For example, Alfred Crosby in Ecological Imperialism showed particularly that environmental crises were an extremely powerful weapon for the colonists. Epidemiological crisis, invasive species, replacement of crops, and change to landscape were decisive factors for the success of the colonist settlement. Then many worked follow the path Crosby opened up. They showed that apart from the environmental crisis directly attributable to colonization, the colonial conservation policy which followed on were usually tools of European imperialism, since they most often led to the elimination, as Manu said in his introduction, of the pre-colonial culture traditional rights over natural resources. The ecofeminism studies of Caroline Merchant are also important to mention in this field, and in India, the one of Vandana Shiva. In India, too, subaltern studies around David Arnold, Ramachandra Guha, Magdal Gadgil focused on the movement against the colonial rules over natural resources and opposed the state management, a good use of nature by grassroots management. I have also to mention the importance of Nature and Empire of John Mackenzie about the hunt in South Africa, and also in a different kind of work, those of Michael Hadas and James Coates about state control and planning science in colonial states. Whereas, in contrast, others consider the policy on resource conservation the experiment in joint management of land with local population in a relatively benevolent light, similar to Grove, even showing that colonization could be attentive to indigenous people. Sorry, this is my music for bus, the school bus. So I was saying that some other work have a relatively benevolent light, similar to Groove, on showing that the colonization could be attentive to indigenous people environmental knowledge and practices. This is a case of William Bernat and Log Hugh research about the rise of conservation in Africa, even if these authors try to keep a good balance between Crosby and Groove's tradition. This is also the approach of the history of science, which seeks to show how colonial science was not just a spread of European science, but a co-construction between indigenous people and the new rulers, at the one of Tom Griffiths and Lily Robin on ecology, or Richard Drayton. If you want to have a good historiographic synthesis of all this work, I recommend you this issue of Osiris, directed by Roy MacLeod. This review is far from exhaustiveness. Nevertheless, it's very useful to have a quick overview of all this study. Very rudely, we can say that these works are caught between two more or less opposing points of view. On the one hand, ecological imperialism, which focuses its approach on colonization devastating effect, on colonial environmental policy as a powerful tool of domination, and on the other one, green imperialism, consider, without denying the environmental upheaval and crisis linked to colonization, that some genuine environmental concerns were taken into account during colonization. This historiographic landscape must not, however, let it thought easy to trace the demarcation lines between the two approaches, because as I was saying before, it's often difficult to get a particular author or study to fit comfortably into one or the other approach. In fact, most of these work recognize at least a concern for managing natural resources among the colonial states, if not the existence of environmental preoccupation. And all of them have in common a close examination of four important points. Firstly, they examine the impact of colonization on the environment, of the environment of the countries colonized. Secondly, the policy aiming to mitigate this impact are central in this study. Thirdly, they study the environmental thought of the colonist seen especially through the colonial environmentalist figure that I displayed on my slide before. And fourthly, there are a particular attention to the co-construction of colonial science, to the process of hybridization of knowledge between Western sciences and local knowledge. Unfortunately, the historical documentation thus compiled does not make it possible to set up the following big question. Sorry, I've got a problem with my PowerPoint. Yeah, the following big question. Did colonial environmental policies significantly limit the colonial plunder of nature? This is one of the important questions I have addressed in my PhD, focusing exclusively on the impact of French colonial forestry in Indochina from 1860 to 1945. I show you the 3 volumes of this PhD. It's a big thesis, more than 1,300 pages, with a lot of map of itinerary of explorer, map of forest at various scale, forest reserve map that I display here. I find those map in Vietnam archives here in Hanoi and reproduce myself manually, as you can see. And as a classical historian job, I read almost all the archives of the French Forest Services in Indochina. I collect a lot of data in order to produce good quantitative analysis of different outcomes of those forest services, like, for example, the map of the spatial development of the cantonnement en division forestière that give a good idea of the capability of the forest guards to control the timber trade and to implement the forest regulations. So I never take time to publish this big work, and sometimes I'm quite frustrating. So if there is some volunteer to help me to find a publisher before to die, I will be very grateful. And I take this opportunity to launch this appeal. So I move to my second part. So before to answer this big question, did colonial environmental policy significantly limit the colonial plunder of nature? I would like first address another difficult question in this part. Was the Indochina forest very rich before the colonization? Actually, it's a difficult question because, again, the source the historian can mobilize are very contradictory in the representation of the forest cover they give. Many sources give the idea that Indochina was covered by thick tropical forests. Others show, on the contrary, a very advanced forest depletion throughout the peninsula. Here, for example, you have a print of extract from the journal Le Tour du Monde. It's a very popular publication at that time in France to shape the public opinion in favor of colonization. This print shows a Dr. Armand, an officer of French Naval Army, a key personage of the French intervention in Tonkin on Annam, walking through a very dense bamboo grove, so dense that his coolies have to cut his route with sharp bush knives. This sort of cliché have many political functions. Perhaps the most important was to construct the white European male explorer as an icon of the heroic colonial epic. And for achieve this political goal, our colonial heroes have to fight with lush and pristine forests, forêt vierge luxuriante, even if it was just bamboo grove that were surely a secondary forest cover after human encroachment, as I know and you surely know too. But the French public opinion ignored everything about the ecology of bamboo in Vietnam at that time and really thinks that these forest landscapes was a realistic representation of the Indochina forest. Sorry. So, as historians, as I really point out in this seminar already, our first duty is to be very cautious with our sources when we try to write environmental history. Not to go in detail of the numerous travel accounts, explorer reports that could be called upon for this exercise, I simply mention here the Universal Geography of Maltebrun, the Universal Geography of Élisée Reclus, the famous and unrevealed Mission Pavie. The overall image these accounts leave is one of a hairy Indochina. I mean hairy like the Roman talk about the hairy Gaul, la Gaule chevelue, to underline the uncivilized character of France before the Romanization. Like this map, drawn from Chabert et Gallois, Atlas of Indochina, published in 1909, which suggests that the whole of Indochina was covered in forest, apart from the Great Delta and coastal plains. Most description of this supposed forest bounty verge on the fantastic. Here, for example, is how Pignot de Bohème, a missionary of Paris Société des Missions Étrangères, described for the King Louis XVI the tremendous unexploited wealth to the peninsula held. Curiously, the construction of this hairy Indochina come into direct contradiction with the exploration reports on which it was based. Most of these accounts show, on the contrary, that the linear area explored were very often a sparse plateau, like this one of Dr. Armand. And the other example is stemmed from the Capitaine Cupet in the Mission Pavis. When you read their accounts of this journey, it's very surprising they never mention that they walk through lush forest, pristine forest. They never mention, like Humboldt done in this famous relation voyage in Amazonia, the beauty of monumental equatorial forest. Therefore, in symmetry with the image of airy Indochina, we see its exact opposite, the notion of barren Indochina. Appears at the same time in many documents, such as this photography of a small indigenous forestry concern at the Red River taken in 1890, drawn from a note by Gustave Dumontier. In this other extract dated from 1865, Dr. Clovis Torrel, an army doctor, reported the speed at which the forest had regressed since the start of colonization. He predicted that at the rate things are going, the whole China forest would disappear within less than 30 years. In this other quotation, Clovis Torrel examined why the slash and burn cultivation destroy a richness which could brought back 1,000 times more than the scene culture than they report to local people. This kind of judgment is very often and very important to underline. This kind of judgment underlines the lack of economic rationality of local use of natural resources is, of course, one of the great arguments of every environmental state policy until now. It's not only the prerogative of colonial empire, actually. And of course, making environmental history is very useful from this point of view. You can show very easily as historian that environmental state management over natural resources has always something in common with colonial domination if policymakers don't pay enough attention to the recognition of indigenous rights over local natural resources. And this is a very, very tricky issue to achieve efficient environmental policy. And to come back to our colonial hero fighting with the bamboo, Dr. Armand, this striking succession of print, always in the popular journal Le Tour du Monde, illustrate this very strong condemnation of local production method by the colonists. I do it again, this succession, a magnificent forest looted by stupid indigenous people for miserable crops, mostly eaten by birds. And again, don't laugh too loud because this colonial discourse is far from to be finished today. This panoramic photo shoot had been taken by the forest consignee in 1930, showed the desertification of the Pleiku Plateau in the central Vietnam. It also aimed to demonstrate the consequence of deforestation without knowing exactly what was the cover in the past, but never mind in the mind of Consigny the forester. This other photo, again by Consigny, showed the erosion of the Jiring Plateau linked to the deforestation. On this forestry map by Mangin et Forbet, published in 1931, here you see the sheet of for Laos. You will see that forests still fairly rich are just the area in dark green. In the map legend, the light green corresponds to secondary depleted or very depleted forest, and the orange area are savanna or even bush with no shrub vegetation at all. The same map for Tonkin, Annam, Cambodia, Cochin China, and Cambodia showed that everywhere the really rich forest was quite scarce at that time. Okay, so this is very interesting, according to me, to oppose this two representation of airy and barren Indochina. As soon as came aware of this strong contradiction in the representation that were given of forest cover in colonial literature, I quickly wonder about the political effects of this contradiction in the effective management of the forest. Everything was thought as if the tropical forest could only be luxuriant and inexhaustible, or on the contrary, very impoverished and threatened, thus dooming them to either unrestricted exploitation desired by different lobby of colonial capitalists, which is therefore the image of every Indochina called up to argue against the implementation of the first forestry regulation, as Commander Reveroni did here, contesting the utility of forestry services in Tonkin because the enemy of Tonkin is the forest. Or, on the contrary, to apply to a policy of conservation advocated by the forester officer, the École de Nancy. I stop just, I don't know, there is a mic. Okay, I continue. So I come back. On the contrary, to a policy of conservation advocated by the forestry officer from the École de Nancy, who arrived in Indochina around the beginning of the 20th century, and never ceased to build the image of a barren Indochina, while mainly accusing the slash and burn farming system of the minority mountain people of the region, as well as the forestry activity of the indigenous community, Chinese and Vietnamese. What immediately becomes apparent is that behind the conflict of representation, there are a conflict of views and conflict of interest. And I think you have to be very cautious of this point when you want to make environmental history, because you have to understand that data like a rate of forest cover, for example, is politically constructed because it's a stake of political struggle. And this is a great contribution of history of science to environmental history, to bring strong methodology to carry out this critical work of the context of the production of the environmental data. So to come back to my previous question, were the Indochina forests rich before the arrival of the European colonists? My answer is now fairly well constructed history. Indeed, I can answer they were already very disturbed in many areas, that primary forest was very scarce. I can add that many other sources that I don't have time to mention bring evidence to prove that the colonization accelerate over exploitation of many forests. But I have also to mention that political and economic interest also shape this representation of forest cover to support a fight against forest conservation policies. So I move to my third part. Yeah. What were the action of French colonial administrative to provide timber market, firewood market, mining needs, railway construction, and to do this better than the indigenous methods of production? In short, what were the basic guiding principle of French colonial forestry in Indochina? The main tool of the French colonial forestry policy in Indochina, but also in French Equatorial and West Africa, was forest reserve classification, forest reservation. What is a forest reserve? I take this quotation from Georges Capu, then head of the Indochina Government General Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Trade, to describe the logic behind it. Capus took a metaphor from banking, saying that the forest is a financial capital from which we can enjoy regular revenue on conditions that we don't eat into the capital. To achieve that, the forest must be organized into felling rotation, as you see in this document. This gives the organization chart to Changbom Reserve in Seri in red color and in cuts in green. Each cut is worked through every 20 or 30 years, which should in theory leave the forest enough time to replenish the volume of trees harvested, the revenue. The revenue must in any case be composed carefully, like diversifying a portfolio, depending on whether the desired product from the reserve is wood for fuel, caissage, construction, timber, or cabinet marketing. The colonial forester calls this way of managing cut rational exploitation, rational lodging. The prime objective is to achieve a sustainable exploitation. And I want to emphasize that when I say here sustainable exploitation, it's not an anachronism. It's really the concept of the French and German forestry since almost the beginning of the 19th century that was imported in Indochina by the French colonial officer that come from the Nancy École des Réformes. The forester also have a second important objective, to enrich the stand, in other words, steadily increase the proportion of first category species for furniture making in relation to the other with the succession of rotation. To do this, before each cut, the forester must mark the trees that must not be felled. The operation is staddling, marking the staddle, which consists of marking with a forester hammer the trees of the desired species too young to be cut. The Forestry Service's final goal is gradually to change the disorderly pie structure they put into reserve into a coppice with standard producing both fuel wood and top quality wood on a cycle governed by both market needs and rate of growth of each species required. The Changbom Reserve near Saigon was the first forest in Indochina to be put into reserve classification in 1892 or 91, depend of the sources. It represents the archetype of the accomplishment of the paradigm of colonial silviculture. And you can see the organization of this picture. This is not a Changbom Reserve, but Titing Reserve, not far from Changbom. The whole ideal of Nancy École des Eaux et Forêts was displayed at that time. We can imagine we are in the forest of Fontainebleau near Paris, but we are in Indochina. And if you visit today the Angkor Temple in Cambodia, please pay attention to the organization of the forest around the great temples. The organization of the road, particularly, and of the roundabout with road in 5-star branch sometime. It has been drawn by Roger Ducamp himself, the first director of General Forest Service in Indochina, with a double goal: first, rational production of timber, and second, game reserve for colonial hunts. Thus, the dominant colonial silviculture built and underpinned its knowledge to shape forest as a woody resource for colonial usages. But not only. And it's totally obvious that French Forest Services in Indochina has devoted its main activity to provide the indigenous demand in firewood and construction timber, and I will come back to this point later in my first point. If we now look more closely to the location of the reserve in relation to the best map available, like this one of Tonkin in 1931, it is clear that the vast majority of the reserve are located around the delta like a forest belt around the center of population, quite far from the densest forest. For the forester, the goal is first and foremost to meet the population firewood needs and the timber requirement of the colonial towns, telegraphic line, railway, mining industry, and so on. The most far-flung and the densest forests were therefore rarely given reserve classification because they had to supply to all those needs. To see through this more clearly, we have to bear in mind that Indochina's forests are part of local estate. In other words, that all the forests belong to state through the local administration, governor of Cochinchina or resident supérieur du Tonkin, de l'Annam, or Laos and Cambodia. There are no private forests like in France and no community forests. The local estate is therefore divided in two. The reserve estate, le domaine réservé, consisting of the area regulating, filling, sustainable production, encircled with red on this map, I hope you can see quite easily, and the protected estate consisting of the area of free felling, meaning extremely destructive cuts with forestry operator working under almost no restriction except certain minimum diameter rules for cutting of certain species that they never respect actually.
Yes, Frédéric,
yeah.
it's quite 40 minutes, so you can continue, but don't hesitate to come to the...
To shorten, okay. So I finish this part and perhaps I will skip the fourth one. A sort of race against time was then engaged between the exhaustion of the so-called protected estate and the constitution of the reserved estate. On this figure, you can see how the surface area reserve classified progressed in hectare during the colonization, but a massive constraint weighed down the forestry services in this exercise. The constitution of the reserve estate had under no circumstance to hold back production. The first head of Indochina Forestry Services, Roger Ducamp, even made it the cardinal principle of this operation in this quotation. On the end of colonization, Indochina was hence covered with 600 reserves distributed as the following map show on sometime over vast land surface area, particularly in countries. Can you cap? Okay. So as you see on this map, the reserve in Cambodia was very huge. Huh? However, in reality, most of these reserves exist only on paper, as the Forest Service manager admits. Roy, in this extract in 1904, he recognized that most of the time forest survey was pure fantasy. The second problem is these reserves are generally very poor because the densest forest wasn't classified as the previous map already showed. In the following 7 slides, I just display for my own pleasure the map of the forest reserves that I found in the archive and that I reproduced with the mean I've got at that time because the picture was not allowed. I don't have the time to go in detail to describe all this map, the reason why and the way in which the Forest Services classified those reserves, the way in which the local authority or local population was informed, the way in people came up to the local authority, to the resident, and sometimes till to the general governor against the reserve classification of the local forest, to tell nothing about the colonist complaint who was more than indigenous people the enemy of the forest regulation, as I have already mentioned with the Commandant Reveroni quotation. The lawsuits for illegal logging in forest reserves are also numerous. And last but not least, there is an important number of declassification during the 1930s to legalize the Vietnamese plantation of tea that have totally nibbled the forest reserve in 15 or 10 years, like those one in Phu province, where you see that the green space is very little compared to the plantation of tea or lac or different Vietnamese crops. This is the same here on this other reserve, where you see all the green place are tea plantation, and other green place are also the decision in the 1930 to create some communal reserve for the population need, because the policy of forest reserve wasn't very efficient. In fact, all the minutes regarding reserve delimitation, all those on reserve management, saddling operation, show that in the vast majority of cases, the reserve were no longer anything more than impoverished scrub with hardly any trees left. As shown in this table of records for Dai Luc Reserve in Phu Tho, so in the north of Vietnam, you can see there is only 0.5% of first category of trees cover, and just 10% of a tree reaching 40 centimeter diameters, and most of these being fourth category ones on this table. There is, you see, the reality which hides behind the colonial statistic of numerous reserves. On the forester own admission, it is impossible in this condition to imagine that methodological forestry production approach can one day take up where a free operation regime left off. So to conclude this part, the calculation I have done of the quantity of wood produced by methodological felling compared with amount from free destructive operation shows that the overall result of colonial forestry services action to be very maigre. As you can see from the two graphs of 1929, the share of methodological felling is in dark gray, is insignificant except for firewood in Cochinchina. Without going into the detail, I think the estimate arrived between 1924 and 1941 is quite rigorous. Over this period, only 3% of the timber and 12% of the fuel wood came from rational lodging. And this proportion is calculated from official data that not taking into account the wood fell without any permit. So conclusion, the forester lost the race against the clock, aiming to replace the free filling of the so-called protected estate by the methodological operation in the reserve area. And this failure is the failure of the methodological strategy, whose main cause came directly from the decision to make conservation subordinated to continuing production work. And on this point, it must be said that the fall come down less to the forestry services than to the Chamber of Agriculture, mining company, and to the civil administration, which incessantly fought the forest action. But unfortunately, I haven't time to go in detail in this competition between different in colonialist interests. So my last part was about, do we have really in Vietnam in Indochina some point where the French forestry policy could be compared to preservation policy? There is some information that rain regime control slab erosion was a concern from the colonial policy. But again, I just show this last graph. You see that the reserve protection for ecological or rain regime control only occupy 1% of the total of the reserve. That means almost nothing compared to the forest cover in all Indochina. I will come back perhaps in the discussion of some concern about reserve naturel intégral or botanical reserve to protect the ecology and to protect pristine forest, but it was wishful thinking, and I can't go in detail. So to finish, I would say that I would like to give you a very short itinerary of the forest action in the French colonial period. I would say that contrary to Groove, we can't see that the first I would say the first constatation of forest destruction doesn't stem immediately to forest protection, because we have to wait around 60 years between the first destruction occur in the colonial sources in 1860 to the real reserve protection in 93. So we can't say that, like Groove said, that destruction leads immediately to protection policy. Actually, I would say that the trajectory of forest colonial history is this one. Destructive exploitation leads to mise en valeur, but the mise en valeur was thinking through the reserve tool like an homogenization of the stand. On the homogenization of the stand, at the end of the colonization, raised some wishful thinking about integral reserve or botanical reserve. But I have to say that there is nothing to see to link with conservation on preservation thoughts that we have seen in my introduction that are rooted in wilderness and land ethics in the colonial experience. I would say that the colonial experience have much more have to do with what we call today sustainable development, and perhaps the failure of this colonial policy because there was no roots with any ethics of nature, explain perhaps that the sustainable development in the colonial period doesn't have no real outcomes of the forest preservation. And I think it's a very important lesson for our present concern. If sustainable development is something like economic rationality with no ethic of nature or land ethic, I think we are condemned to repeat the same experience than the colonial one. Thank you. I'm sorry to have to be too long and not to finish exactly what I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you very much. So we can jump directly to the Bradley presentation.
So I have to withdraw my presentation.